There's a there's a cool pattern um, that you learn in some NLP classes, not all. But I heard about it a number of years ago, and it's a pattern about how we become convinced of something, convinced that you know something, convinced that something is good, or convinced that you believe something. And it's really interesting to notice how you become convinced and to learn your particular pattern, so that if you want to become convinced of something, and I'm not saying becoming convinced about something that isn't feasible, but sometimes we want to be convinced about our ability to do something, um, or just that we know something. And so I'll unpack a couple of the different variables, and then we can talk about an exercise so you can learn your pattern. And over the years, as I've gotten to know what my pattern is, I find it really empowering, because if I want to get convinced and I want to go directly for that, I know kind of my recipe, so I can get there a little bit more quickly. I know the ingredients that go into me becoming convinced about something. So some of the variables are a couple things. Some people want to see something, some people want to hear something, they may want to hear it from someone else. Some people want to experience it or do it for themselves. You could ask yourself the question, how do you become convinced that you're good at something? That's one question you could ask. You could ask, how do you become convinced that somebody else is good at something? So we have those first three variables, which is, basically, is it a visual evidence, auditory, or kinesthetic? And is the evidence coming from your own experience, or are you getting it from someone else? The other thing that you'll notice, another variable, is how many times you need to experience your evidence to become convinced. So for example, some people only need one example, and it might need to be a big example, but they need one example, and that'll be it. They'll be like, okay, I've seen that, I'm convinced. I think the example of the 4-minute mile being broken, for many people it was like that. Before it had been broken, everyone had this belief that it couldn't be broken. As soon as one person did it, that was enough to shatter that belief and at least open up the possibility of the new belief for many, many people. I can't remember the number. Many people broke the 4-minute mile after the first person did it. So for some people, you only need one example. For someone else, you might need several examples. And then, or you might need a lot of examples, depending upon your particular convincer strategy. And then there's another thing, which is the rate at which you experience those examples. Some people like to experience or need to experience a bunch of examples in a very short period of time, and then they kind of get tipped over a threshold. Whereas other people need examples spread over time, and it's kind of a duration thing, and then they'll become convinced. I had sort of an experience of this years ago. I was being a TA for a structures class, which was basically math. It was basically kind of fundamental physics math. And I had already taken the class. So I had passed the class, but then as a TA, my job was to grade everyone's homework. It's about 30 people, grade their homework, 2 assignments a week. So it was a lot of grading to do. And what I found was, by going through all these examples really quickly, all of a sudden I was getting convinced that I knew all this stuff. At least and not only did I know it, I knew it at a much deeper level, obviously, than I had when I just did it once in the class. If you had asked me right after the class, hey, on chapter 13, we covered this. Are you convinced that you know that? I would have definitely said no. After grading everyone's paper, I became convinced that I had most of the topic down. So number of examples, the rate of examples, and then you can look also, I sort of hinted at it with people who need one example. There is a thing about the intensity of the example, or how stark it is. So if somebody was not particularly good at their work and then they did a good job one day, that may not be enough for them. But if they did an outstanding job on a day, that might make them convinced that at least they were capable of that. So there can be intensity of it. You know, if you're picturing something, if it's pictures, you may want to make the pictures really big, really bright. And then when I was learning this, I was told by my teacher at the time that there were some people who essentially didn't really become convinced ever. And with those people, it's as if they need to get reconvinced every day or anytime they need that thing. So, and I'm sure you've met people like this. If you say like, oh, well, you're good at this, it's like it bounces off of them. And even if there's evidence right in front of them, they might say, yeah, but this is just one example. So they may need to be convinced again and again. And if you have friends or colleagues like this, it's a really good thing to know, because you'll just know that you need to give them evidence on a regular basis, or they won't ever be convinced. So one thing that I would recommend is write down a list of 4 or a half dozen things that you're just convinced of about yourself or about the world. I'm convinced about my ability to teach guitar. So that's one thing that I have. I'm convinced of my ability to brush my teeth every day. Let me see. I'm convinced that anybody can learn. So these are some of the things that I have. And then once you have your list, you can begin to go through them. And what I like to do is ask myself the question, how did I become convinced of this? And at what point did I become convinced of that thing? And I'll also look at kind of the structure of how I hold it now. I noticed, part of my being convinced is that I have many examples and they're all stacked together. And by the way, this is a whole other topic, but this obviously relates to your identity. If you say, I'm convinced that I'm capable of learning, that's a belief about your identity. Like, I'm a learner. That can be a very, very powerful thing to know how to build for yourself. So make your list of half dozen things that you're convinced of, and begin to unpack what's the structure of how you're holding those, and how did you become convinced? At what point did you become convinced? In the example that I gave of teaching class, that was a really obvious time when I became convinced in that moment. I had one example where even though I was a little skeptical, it was one example, and it convinced me that at least it was possible. And that was, I was playing guitar, and I had a belief about how quickly I could play. I thought that the size of my hands and my physicality, I really believed that I was only capable of playing so fast. And one day I was playing with somebody, and just sitting there and kind of watching myself play as I was playing, and all of a sudden my hand just sped up way past what I thought was possible for me. And in that moment, I became convinced that more was possible. because I just remember sitting there and watching my hand and kind of being, wow, this is amazing. It's going beyond what I thought was possible. So I guess for me, having one good juicy example is enough at least to open it up. I don't know that I became convinced that I was a fast player at that point, but I definitely became convinced that I was capable of that. So make your list of 6 examples, or if your convincer is having more examples, make a list of more examples and look for them for commonalities in terms of when you became convinced of that thing and how that took place. Was it visual? Was it auditory? Was it something that you had to do? Was it a combination of those things? Did it have something to do with many examples in a short period of time or spread out over time, or the intensity of the examples? And once you get your kind of your menu, your recipe for doing that, then you can pick something new and go out and build reference examples so you can become convinced more quickly. So have some fun with that.